Hi, and welcome to the Grateful Podcast. I'm Michelle Grant, your host, and it's wonderful to have you here as we explore what it means to lead sustainable change. We look at how each of us can play our role in building a more just, generative, and even joyful future for our food systems, communities, and our planet. Now, one of the things that's come up a lot recently in thinking about and talking about our role in creating sustainable change is the importance of community in this process. And as you may or may not know, The Grateful is the name of a podcast, but it's also a platform where we offer leadership and coaching trainings for women who are looking to play their role in creating sustainable change and looking for a supportive community along that journey. And inside our community, we do a range of different activities that support us on these three levels of working with ourselves, working with others, and working with change. And one of the things we did recently in the community was watch a documentary together, which was called Together We Grow. And it's a really nice free documentary. You can check it out on YouTube if you like. It profiles a community in New Zealand who have come together in a really unique way to support each other, to care for each other, to make sure everybody is food secure, to make sure resources are utilized in a more circular fashion, and generally to just be there for each other when times are challenging. And after watching this documentary, we had a really interesting conversation about what is community, what's its role in creating change, and really interestingly, what does leadership look like when we view it through the lens of community? Because that was a really interesting part of this documentary is how participatory and collaborative the leadership really was. And this mirrored some of the things I've been thinking about and reading as well. So we thought it would be nice if a few of us from the community got together and kept this conversation going, but this time recorded it so that we could share it with you, to give you an opportunity to also reflect on the role community plays for you in creating change, and to perhaps help you integrate thoughts around community building, being part of community, followership and leadership, and how all of these things might help you on your own journey to create change. So today's podcast is a relatively relaxed, semi-structured conversation where we explore what community means to each of us, how our understanding of it has shifted and adjusted over time, how community has supported each of us in our process of either responding to or trying to guide change. And we also talk about what community can bring in an educational context, as all of us play a role as educators in our work. We all have slightly different yet interconnected backgrounds. Sina is from Germany and has a background in design and leadership for sustainability. Shruti is Indian and grew up in Kenya and has a background in international development, agriculture, and food security. Kenza grew up in Morocco and has a background in environmental engineering, agroecology, and resilience. And me, who you already know a little bit, my background's also in environmental engineering, but more recently in food systems and sustainability and leadership for change. I hope you enjoy our conversation. At the end, you'll find a few reflection questions as well that perhaps you want to discuss within your community or do as a little journaling exercise for yourself. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Grateful Podcast. What brought you here on a public holiday to talk about this topic of community and change? What is it that feels alive for you at the moment? What are you curious about? What brought you here today?
So for me, I am curious about this word community because I feel like it was not in my vocabulary for such a long time. And I assumed that it was part of other people's vocabulary, but it wasn't kind of something for me. And the more I've been part of this grateful community, the more I've just realized how valuable a community is. And I've also started, when we had that movie discussion, thinking more about what does it really mean to be part of a community. So I wanted to take part in this discussion and see where it leads.
I think what I find interesting with community is that I've been part of a couple of different communities, I guess, that connected online for a certain purpose, coming together to support each other and explore something together. And that was very different from the sense of community I had until then, because previously, having grown up in a village, I always had this idea of a very like local community that just happens to be in one place and finds ways or not to do the best that they can together. And either you have a strong or less strong community and therefore a better or worse experience. And so this opening up of new ways of coming together and building community to experience something together or also achieve something together, it's really interesting. And I'm very curious how people integrate that in their life, because I assume they also have somewhat of a local community, and what the benefits are, especially long term.
I actually joined the discussion today out of curiosity, and also because I wanted to make sense out of this word community and reflect on it with a group of people that were also interested to do so. And because over the last few years, I've been bumping into it mostly. What does it mean to practice a community? In my research, when we talk about community, it's mostly linked to food system sciences, how to build social ecological resilience, and how basically communities play a big role out of it. And it's one of the big hypotheses that we always bring. And then when we use this word a lot, what does it truly mean in terms of practice? So that's mostly the reason why I was here today, just to rethink, to develop, to unfold and shed lights on different aspects of it.
I think what instigated setting up this discussion, but also an inquiry into this topic, was for me a few things. We watched this film together, Together We Grow, and they kept using this term community the whole way through. And my main question at the end of the film was, what do they mean by that? Because it was clear they were in the same geographical location, but when they were talking about community, they weren't talking about everybody in this town. It was a select group of people that were clearly brought together by some shared things. And so it was really interesting to think about how do they define that? And it's clearly played an important role in the change they've brought about, but to kind of understand and unpack that a little bit more. And we also had a really interesting conversation in the last round of Be the Change. A participant was kind of exploring what direction she wants to go in terms of what work to do and where to be based. And she asked the other participants what has been the most enriching experience for them, being in communities based around values and shared identity, or being in communities based around a shared geographical, like physical location. And then recently I also started to think, spending some time in Italy, about how communities can also be used to create destruction, in the sense of things like the mafia. One can think of as like one of the most powerful communities and arguably bringing about change, but not necessarily for a greater good. So what is it that makes a community affect quote unquote positive change versus quote unquote negative change? And, you know, how do kind of fear and love play out in shaping those drivers? So those are some of the things I've been thinking about recently that I thought might be interesting to start to unpack together. I loved how you've also recently come to realize the importance of this word, even if it's been present for a long time in your lives. It's a recent, like, this is really interesting, actually. Let's unpack this. Let's understand it further. And so in that process, what do you understand as community now? How would you define it for yourself? And maybe it's a work in progress, your definition.
I think that's something I've been thinking about since we had that discussion, Michelle. So this idea of when is a community supportive as opposed to when is it destructive or burdensome. Thinking about my situation, I grew up in this like Indian community, quite traditional, and I never thought of it as a community because it was really quite difficult to fit into this identity that that community had created for me. Or, you know, as a Gujarati girl, this is what you should be. in order to be part of this community. And so it felt really burdensome when you're kind of defined by your age, your gender, your caste, as opposed to when you feel like you belong to a community just because of whatever you are. So it's kind of like related to maybe a bit more the values you have, and you find some commonality with other people, sort of regardless of your background. So I think it's this really fine balance of being able to be yourself, but also being able to relate to others and finding some commonality with others in that community.
I think you mentioned something that was interesting for me at the film, talking about, we always say community in international development. Like, do we know what we're talking about? How has that part of the definition shifted for you recently?
I think this is just fundamental, because so much of our work, we say that we work with marginalized communities, right? Or local communities, community health workers. So the vocabulary is everywhere. And like the assumption is that these communities exist, they function in a communal way, right? That there are people, making this happen. And it's actually not the case at all. Like in many places, what we're actually talking about is just people living together in a particular location. But all the processes that need to be in place in order for a project to be successful depend on community. And we assume that there are local leaders, there are role models, there are supportive processes, like structures in place, without actually putting any effort into building those up. So I think if we paid more attention to that, I think development projects would look a lot different to what they look right now.
So you're nodding along. Do you want to jump in next?
So I really like what Shruti was saying regarding how to define it and what would it mean basically for us, this word community. And I also grew up somehow similarly in a Moroccan family type of community, where basically we're all growing very close together, constantly being together and learning to be together within this constellation, with our defining characteristic that somehow stays. When you're in a family, you have a stamp, and this is what you are in a group, not alone, yourself isolated. And that was shaping, obviously, a lot my life, our dynamics, our collective dynamics. And I think that obviously, like many teenagers, at some point you need to understand who you are outside of this community. And the journey to Switzerland, my studies, and life eventually later on in different system, in a different constellation, in a different environment. The Swiss environment, for example, is a bit more isolating. So then you enable also to find yourself outside of a community, and then eventually get back to other type of communities that would be more value oriented, basically, or like we will share the same narrative or same preferences or same even political opinion, or it could be a community with a certain job affiliation, food system community. And all along, like this journey of trying to find spaces of resonance, then it's quite interesting, because with the time you also get back to then, what is a family community, and how did you learn from the practice of being together all those years in your family, and how do you bring that practice back to those new non-familiar, whatever a family means, but not a family community. In community practices, some of the practices could be even identified as toxic, this idea of like being together, and then still always having like power oppression, power plays, and how you want to get rid of some of them, and how do you want to welcome some other practices. But eventually, like, you have things that makes these dynamics of being together with our vulnerabilities, with our strength, with our own characteristic, still interesting and fundamental for us to be with again over time.
I like what you just said about care, because I think that's a central aspect that I've only just started to understand about communities. I think I always understood it that a community is a group of people brought together by shared values or identity, or a group of people that kind of share some geographical space. But I was reading this book, The Art of Community, recently, and the author defines communities as individuals who share a mutual concern for one another's welfare. And I was like, yes, that's the glue really that keeps the communities together. And I think that's what I really appreciate in this community as well, is like how much there's an obvious care for one another. And when somebody has a challenge, how others kind of rally together to support. And for me, when I thought back on all the different communities I felt a part of, it's the ones that not only speak about, but actually demonstrate that care for others' well-being, that feel like are the most supportive and that endure tension and conflict, which is inevitable when any humans do come together. So I think that's been a new addition in my understanding. And also this idea of it's not only shared values, but I think a community is one that also has a certain shared narrative that shapes their identity, which goes beyond just having shared values.
When you ask the questions, the first thing that I wrote down is a sense of home, relationships that hold one, and also push for growth. And I think when I heard Shruti share, what I wrote down then is community versus network and function versus experience. And it made me think whether there's like an kind of inside and outside view. So when I am in a community where I feel like this is my community because there's a sense of belonging with values and interests, but then also there's relationships that I know that community holds me, but it also pushes me to grow. And I encourage others to grow because there's a mutual interest to transform or change or make a contribution. And then there's also these communities where we use the word because it's more of a functional way. It's kind of a grouping to make sense of something that we look at rather than that we experience and have a sense of from personal experience. It's just really interesting, this kind of sense making in a relational way because you're in a community. Maybe there's more of like a home, and Kenza, you mentioned family also, and it's sometimes it's like not naturally family bonds or relationships and building them yourself, and on what basis.
Yeah, like that addition of growth, like it's that where care meets growth. And also that is interesting, right? Because even though families are organic in the sense like we're born into them, without a certain amount of fostering and community building, in a sense, it doesn't necessarily have that same function of support and care and growth. Whereas on the other side, you can, meet people that you have absolutely no blood relation to, but if you're a part of a process that fosters community and there is that care for one another, then you end up with that feeling of being really connected.
So here I hear two things: this feeling of being connected, maybe the quality of those connections and how does it feel and how beautiful it is, but also how it's inscribed in a certain temporality and how with time do we manage to nourish those communities. So I think that it's basically a key element of how we should define a community is related with time and across generations or along different rhythm, paces, momentum, also feelings. Are we a community of peace and love, whatever you want? And are we still sticking together in vulnerable moments or in difficult times? Those moments basically are fundamental for us to be able to call a community, because then it's also through this temporality, then we can also be able to define what is those dynamics or interconnections or feelings.
I think that's an interesting point because on the one hand, it needs to be kind of self-regulating in a sense, like the community should take care of itself and sort of be self-sufficient in a sense. But there's also this kind of need for leadership or someone who takes the initiative and just sort of make sure that things run or make sure that people are included. So there's this curation part of community. It doesn't just happen organically, right? Like you said, in the case of family, even families don't feel like communities. People always feel like maybe they don't belong to their family. So I think there's where we kind of need to talk about leadership, but it's a word that's not often heard together with community. Right? So you kind of think of community builders and leaders as somewhat different. They're kind of put in two different buckets, but I think actually they're more similar than we realize.
And indeed are the most effective and empathetic leaders, community builders at heart. I think that's an interesting point. What do you think, or what have you experienced to be really important in community building? What do you think are the key ingredients to foster community? Maybe you have examples rather than theory of when you've been in a community and really noticed, oh, that really helped build connection, or that really helped foster community.
Yeah. So what seemed to be important for me over the last few years in this community building are basically two things. The first one is a very easy one, humor. And how can we all connect by simply laughing, but laughing from our guts, This idea of being together, resonating on that same kind of humor perspective. Then I think that it's very federative, or at least for me, this is high on my priority. It's very light, but it's still very important because it carries a practice of being with joyfully. And also then the other thing is maybe the mirroring effect of this, being together in vulnerable moments, in sadness, in nervousness, this also authentic self that is not the joyful authentic self, that is the one enabling the other side of the coin to be. And once those two are done, because it's easy to be able to laugh with a lot of people and just be together in funny times, just as much being together in despair, in confusion, in doubts, in insecurities is very relevant. And it's quite interesting because from the last few years only, since I've been reflecting on this notion of a community, of belongingness, of where, how, with whom, I realized that we jump very much from an extreme to another. So the group of people we have a lot of fun with, but as soon as we step a bit into the deep part of talking about feelings, uncomfort and so on, then it becomes a bit weird. And then the other group of people that find themselves more into the seriousness, into the depth of struggles and vulnerabilities that still exist in everyone's life, but bringing it to a lighter dimension, then it becomes a bit tough. So how to handle a bit those two extremes and try to have a bit also of a balance and a harmony in the dynamic of both within one group.
I mean, I think it's actually the starting point is sort of having this realization that maybe you're in a community and you have a role to play in that community. People maybe are in communities, but maybe they're not kind of aware of sort of this power that they have to shape their community, to kind of get more out of their relationships. So I think there's this, it's a bit awareness of how we can be in relationship with each other, help ourselves and help each other. And the other part is inclusion, which is also just related to care. So really caring about others means making sure that they feel included and they're also getting the most out of their community and being able to bring themselves into the community. It sounds easy, but I think it also requires a lot of skill and practice.
From what I've experienced, to add to this, community is kind of reinforced or strengthened when there's a sense of picking something up and moving the dial. So that could be a project or summer camp. We're a community now, and taking action and then celebrating that. So the sense of achievement and celebration, and in that process, seeing each other, how they are and live and act, and understanding each other better through that, and helping each other out, and then celebrating. So there's also a sense of journey together. And hopefully that strengthens and not breaks it up. I also have the sense that through that, people have the chance to find their place even better. So this being together is really connecting, but then having a sense of reinforcing that or finding more depth through mutual challenge to overcome, and then celebrate, and then reinforce the sense, oh, I really belong here, or I belong here even more than somewhere else.
I like that. Like an overcoming, celebrating loop is what builds a kind of connection, and having humor in that process, like Kenza said.
Here, I think that then the temporality becomes also all the more important. And this is how I think that family or cultural communities are defined most of the time, is because there is this temporary celebration or being together in hard and good times. And this is very well inscribed for me in my Moroccan family or in my Moroccan life. This is how I realized that the importance of rituals and tradition were actually essential. Is like how they enable us to be together at peace in hard times, for example, just because we have those rituals and traditions. But also installing like rituals of celebration in a more positive way, in a positive moment, and having that repeated over time, that brings also like a rhythm to that community that needs to happen, because otherwise then we also carry too much on our shoulder as like leading a certain community, or fostering or bringing a certain pace or momentum to a certain dynamics of human beings. And I think that then the acknowledgement of certain celebrations, certain rituals, certain tradition enable that to then evolve organically and be. And small things, like my family, we have the spring dinner. So every spring, beginning of spring, it's all the harvest, and we have this. Or we have, of course, like all the Muslim parties that I still like to keep. And this, what's make a year, but this is also, you have a problem to approach with a relative, or like you have something that is actually pending and is too heavy on your heart, and you would like it to erode with time. Then you know that the erosion might happen with a big party. So it's also like dancing with milestones and bringing those milestones a bit visible to the eye of everyone, that would enable actually to very subtly tackle problems or shed lights on solutions.
That's really beautiful. And I think this idea of leadership, as always, comes down to how we define it, right? Whether we see leadership in community is actually every person being empowered to see that they are a leader in a certain aspect of this whole thing that the community is looking at, and being empowered and able and supported to step into that, so that it is a participatory and shared process of guiding ourselves and guiding others, and a dance between the two. I think in community, a framing of leadership in that way can be a really beautiful exploration as well, because it really takes us away from this myth of the heroic leader who's the one saving everybody, and distributes that around the community, so that people not only feel empowered, but are also, as we talked about a few times, Sina, dance between followership and leadership. And I think that gives you that beautiful reciprocity of giving and receiving. That, for me, is a big part of what a community brings as well. That ability to experience reciprocity. So I'm interested for each of you. I mean, we've all been in various communities. We all are still in various, sometimes intersecting communities. What and how have communities supported you, either in trying to navigate change or in trying to drive change? How do communities support you in change processes? Whether that's kind of responding to or driving.
for me, they're this fuel that you need to kind of stay focused on whatever change you want to work towards, whether it's for yourself or something external. I think one of the most important things that I've experienced, like through the Grateful community and some other communities that I'm also part of, is like the ability to be vulnerable, to share your problems and not be judged, and being able in that way to actually find yourself in others. So you're not this person alone out there experiencing these challenges, and you realize, okay, well, there's actually a lot of other people out there who have the same questions, and we can learn together, we can grow together. And it's just so enriching being able to be on this journey with others. So for me, that's how I've experienced community and change.
And I think that, well, for me anyway, that realizing you're not alone is also a foundation for collective action, because as long as we think challenges we're dealing with are our own problem or our own issue, and we keep them internalized and ruminate on them and try and solve them ourselves, we never connect with others and realize, this is a shared challenge. There are these systemic issues and aspects to it. And we never then kind of come together and actually collectively try and change things. So yeah, I think that's a really important aspect for me as well, that realizing you're not alone, and that can lead to the collective action we need as well.
I think it's also like building on that. It's this realization that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have all the knowledge. And in fact, maybe we don't need knowledge. Maybe we need this togetherness. Maybe we need this action and collective action that comes from each other and doing what we're doing, but doing it together and doing it systematically.
I actually really like the statement of maybe we don't need knowledge. A couple of things that I just wrote down while listening, or when you asked the questions, was to be seen and to be known to start with, because already that is so encouraging. And from that and regular gatherings, that's also something you mentioned, Shruti, is being witnessed in what we do. And sometimes we receive encouragement and sometimes we are called out of what we do. But this is helping us to move forward and make a contribution and also drive new things, because I've experienced that I shared a random story or something that I enjoyed on the side, and it wasn't even the main topic. And after a while, people approached me again saying like, oh, you mentioned this and that, can you help me? Or do you have advice? Or I would really like to maybe just experience that together. And that wouldn't have happened and opened the door for anything new if I wouldn't have made myself known in that way or shared something. And doing that regularly, it's a journey and ritual of coming together, allows for more of that.
Well, I'm thinking about the social ecological resilience for communities and things like this, but maybe actually a community is defined simply by the fact that they share the same vulnerabilities, or that they share like moments or struggles together.
It's that combination of being able to be vulnerable without questioning your belonging. So knowing that you'll belong even if you are vulnerable. I think that's what is enabled in the community. I think I had some similar thoughts. The first one that I was thinking about is definitely that realization you're not alone and that's needed for collective action. But I was also thinking how communities are actually necessary for the change we want to see, simply because it's in community that we shift narratives. So we can shift our own narrative, and that can happen in community by realizing the different perspective of others, hearing the stories of others. But it's also in a community that we reshape a narrative or change a narrative or see another way forward together. So I think that's, for me, an important part as well. The other thing is this practicing of reciprocity. And I think that being able to both give and receive is what is so fundamental for our well-being as humans. And I think that that's one of the most important things that community brings, is that feeling of connection and feeling of belonging. And within that, that ability to practice both giving and receiving, which is what we need in times of change or in order to move change forward. And then the last thing that I was thinking about is just how I notice that a lot. If I spend times working by myself, you just lose momentum, you lose inspiration, you lose motivation at one point, and how it's in community that you can kind of moderate that. You can bounce off others' energies when some are feeling a bit low, others are high, and you modulate. And it's there that you get momentum together to kind of keep moving things forward, even when it feels really hard. And a lot of the topics we're trying to tackle in our work are really hard and complex. And so we need that energy that comes from community to keep the forward momentum. Also a kind of finding balance through the reciprocity, in a sense of like, we hit those boundaries and we also see who can contribute what and who can't. And there's a dance between that. It's not always one on the go all the time, but it's others picking up things at different times. So the boundaries also kind of shift in that way. Are there any like concrete examples of communities you've been a part of and how they've helped you in times of change or moving things forward?
I don't have a specific community in mind apart from the Grateful community, which is the one that I really love being part of. And the thing I want to say that I think we haven't really touched on is I think building a community and even being part of a community, it's not easy. I think it requires some effort. So I think, we should just kind of be cognizant of that. It requires resources and time and willingness. It's not just this thing that somehow magically comes together when all the stars are aligned and people get together one evening and they decide to form a community. I think there's lots of communities like that out there, but not necessarily sustainable. And, there's so many times when we attempt to create cohesion between people and it doesn't always work. So I think it's not this thing that can just happen without effort. Like, I think it needs a lot of skill and dedication. That's also been illustrated by the Grateful community.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point because I've been involved in a lot of different community building efforts, many of them fully volunteer-based and very often not sustainable as a result. Because it does require a lot of time and energy and resources. And if we're not honoring that in whatever way, normally people burn out or there's a problem with kind of a lot of turnover with people taking up the slack of it. So I find that really interesting. I've also been a part of other volunteer-based things that do sustain. So I think it's super interesting to think about what enables that. And I think a big part of it is exactly what you just said, is the recognition of how much goes into it. And so particularly if people are doing it on a volunteer basis, that what they're getting out of it is aligned with their effort. And that might not be in a monetary way, but really being explicit about that and talking about it and making sure that that work is honored in an appropriate way. Otherwise, it can lead to kind of resentment and frustration and tension, which can eventually erode what you're trying to build.
I so relate to that in terms of like my work in development cooperation, where there's a huge emphasis on scale, right? So getting innovations or getting projects, interventions, as we call them, to reach masses and masses of people. And it all kind of sounds good in theory because it assumes that these processes of care, structures of care, quality of relationships are not going to be affected by that scale and that people are going to be willing to volunteer their time and effort into making sure that everything happens, everybody's included, but it's so not the case. And in fact, like some of the most successful projects happen in a community where these care processes, the relationships are really in place and have been for a long time. So they have this solid foundation of a genuine community existing. And it's from that foundation that like further progress can be made. And I feel like we just don't invest enough into building that foundation of community.
Yeah, there's so much focus on breadth before depth.
Exactly.
I remember in the summer school a few years ago, one of the partners we were working on to kind of help co-design solutions to the issues they were facing. One of them was exactly this. They had this amazing innovation effectively to try and connect consumers in the city with producers on the farm in a more direct way. And it was really functioning around this set point of about 90 participants. They were making sure there was some volunteer work, but the person was remunerated. And they'd got this great big grant to expand their work really quickly. And that was their exact concern. How do we expand this and scale it while keeping this foundation of community, which is at the heart of this whole thing, working? And I think it's a really interesting question. Are there any questions any of you brought along today that you wanted to hear others' perspectives on?
So I have a question actually for Michelle and Sina. So I'm really interested in this idea of building community, right? But I don't know where to start. I'm just interested to know, first, I'm interested to know what's out there in general, like how much of this is part of the conversation, like in the society that we live in. Because to me, it seems like quite a niche thing, even in education, for example, we don't really have like specific courses or careers that focus on this, but it seems really important to me. So that's kind of one question for me that's out there. And then secondly, it's just more about resources and also infrastructure, because I think that's also an issue, right? Like you have communities, but often, for example, they don't have a place to meet. Right, like having physical spaces, just having some basic resources, like seems to be a problem. I'm just curious about your experiences on that as well.
I think the place to start is, like, if you're intentionally building community, the first questions for me are always like these three things: for whom, for you, and for what. And what I mean by each of those three, for whom is, who do you want this to serve? What do they need? Why are there gaps in that at the moment? The second part is for you, like, what are you trying to get out of this in terms of your own, why do you need this space, basically, and what energizes you about it? Also to think about where are the boundaries of what I can do and what others might want to pick up. And then the third part, the what, to what end? Best case, this works and we support each other and we build this community. To what end? What do we hope that it contributes to? So I think those are always, when I start any new project or community concept, those are always quite central questions. And to explore all of those in a participatory way with anybody who might want to be involved in this space. And then the second part on resourcing, I think, is the fourth question, like the how, is so very context specific and something I still struggle to navigate, wanting to be inclusive and have accessibility to anybody who is in need or can benefit, and acknowledging that resources are needed. And if you want to make it sustainable, there needs to be a way to bring in those resources, whether it's through member fees or whether it's through foundation or an organization supporting it because they want to support this outcome. And then the resourcing of the where, that's super important. So even though we have a hybrid format in this community, there are some things in person, majority of it is online because it's international. That still requires building an online space. Like we have a custom online space and that requires resources too. And I think if those things aren't sort of thought through in the beginning, that can also be what just becomes a constant stumbling block because you keep facing these challenges over and over. So I don't know, did that answer your question in any way?
Yeah, thanks. I think you answered that really well. And it's also, something that we covered in Lead the Change as well, right? Like the 5P process. So it's bringing that back to my mind as well.
Sina or Kenza, if you want to add anything to that kind of where do you start question around community from your experiences?
I have been working with and in community in different capacities over the last years. And so one thing I would want to offer is think about also why you want to engage in community, and maybe there's a different way. So for me personally, I really enjoy hosting. And so starting sometimes it's also finding opportunities to practice and finding out what your entryway to building and leading community can be. And on another side of things, I've joined communities just for the interest of wanting to learn something. So in my case, that was dancing, and I've been in very different places around the world and different communities. And looking back, some of them have been so engaging. And I wasn't even going in with the lens of community, but I've learned so much about it, of how people connect and how it felt and how it flowed, that sometimes thinking back of experience you might have had gives you an idea of what you appreciate and how communities are running and built. Not saying that one is better than the other, but one really worked for me and another really did not.
Super interesting. Thanks, Ina. That's really good to know.
I think that speaks again to this like myth, perhaps, that communities organically grow when actually there's so much fostering and so much curating that's maybe happening behind the scenes, or that people don't realize is happening. I think that's the best type of that work too, is when it's so subtle that it's not even obvious that it's happening.
So I have a question on the other part of just education, the formal education system, and how community building kind of features in that or not.
Yeah, because my impression is that in teaching and education at the moment, the ones that are happening within certain institutions are reproducing sometimes very hierarchical, very dominant, very oppressive practices. And that's a bit contrasting in my perspective to now the movements that exist, the communities of care that starts to emerge aside from those institutions that are more, for example, related to the questions of genders, of climate. How I do see that in some of the students that I have that are maybe like 10, 15 years younger than me, and that completely embed a bit this idea of like being together in face of harsh, insecure times, and being together authentically together, being able to express yourself, not only express yourself, just like live a certain alternatives with care, with inclusion, with vulnerabilities on different layers. I think that here, for me, it's beautiful to see that the students are embedding sometimes those values of what it is to be in a community, and oftentimes, unfortunately, still in some education institutions and teaching programs as well, it's not really fostered, or it's not yet encouraged. So this is why I think that integrating the sense of community in the teaching and education is fundamental, but has to be done also on a structural level, and has to be understood in a way that we need to shape a bit the system we're navigating so that it welcomes this. But that's also a big meta question I have for myself. Do we really want institutions to set this? Because I wonder if now, in a very decentralized, in a very organic way, it's done completely outside of those institutions. And some of those institutions become completely obsolete, while a momentum is happening on the streets or everywhere outside of those ones. And so maybe instead of trying to reshape and give again more voice to those institutions, try to give more voice to the ones that are currently practicing this care, practicing this inclusion, practicing this being together, authentic, vulnerable over time. I also know that from your program, from the classes that I took with you, Michelle, that highly inspired me in the World Food System Center like years ago, enabling those spaces to be, and enabling like a community to emerge out of a similar experience. This is exactly what I have the feeling that I experienced after the World Food System Center summer schools, is because we lived together for 2 weeks, sharing, learning, like being nourished basically from the same elements, like intellectual and food element, because it was delicious. How then all of a sudden, for me, it was obvious that we were part of a same community eventually, out of that teaching experience. And it's not a teaching experience, the grateful community, but it's also learning, a co-creation, sharing knowledge type of experience that then just foster a bit this idea of like, hey, we've been through the same thing. So I don't know you, but I know that we lived the same. So what I'm trying to say is that from my perspective, there should be space for teaching and educational experiences within those institutions that would at least be a reminder that it's possible to do it.
And I think that comes back to that overcoming and celebrating cycle. And, as you mentioned, like these climate communities, this is a group of people coming together for their own survival, like really overcoming a massive challenge that we're facing. And I notice that I'm living in a rural area at the moment, and I have never felt more quickly like I belong in a community than I do here. And so often it's linked to things happen and you need to come together. Yesterday the neighbors' bees were swarming, and so everyone needs to pitch in and help. Or if I got COVID, the neighbors were bringing over vegetables, and it's just that never happens in the city. And I think it's this feeling like if we want to collectively overcome, we need to care for each other. And it's this visceral feeling of it. And I feel like those students feel that too. And that's like this incredible driver of community that, like you say, they're taking outside of institutions where they don't feel that care and they don't feel that connection.
I just want to say, like, they're also able to do it in different ways, right? Because a lot of these institutions, they prescribe, like, this is how you should go about dealing with this challenge or dealing with this threat, right? This is the way it should be done. And once you break out of that, actually, we don't have to stick to these norms. We don't have to do it how it's been done. We can make our own way. We can make up our own rules, right? We can experiment. So it's kind of this not being bound by another's ideas of how it should be done. I think that's the other powerful thing about community. You can make it up for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And what matters collectively. And maybe that connects to this question you have about the role of community and learning. And I think for me, teaching and creating learning spaces has always been about this interface of being a facilitator and being a community builder. And I think a big part of trying to run educational programs in that way is also for my own joy and my own benefit, because I think when you bring people together to learn from one another and see that as a part of a community building process, it's so much richer for you as an educator because you learn so much more and you get so much more connection. And so I've always, in any programs I've run, always tried to build community in the cohort that's connecting, but also afterwards. And that's kind of effectively what's happening in the Grateful community too, is that there is a shared experience that's going through a learning experience together and then staying on in community after. And I notice if I have to drop in and do a lecture or drop in and do a part of a bigger program, I always struggle because I don't feel that connection or belonging, because I don't feel like maybe there has been a community building process, but I haven't been a part of it. And so, yeah, as an educator, I see those things as a fundamental part of creating both an effective and an enjoyable learning environment. Is like, how do we facilitate the space and how do we build community to connect people and to meet these learning objectives?
I think that the Grateful community is a perfect example of how, through a shared experience, through shared values, through also like a common ground that lies on that food system of sustainable thinking, can we, well, first shed lights on connections and interconnections happening between various human beings all around the world, and also enables those links to be valorized, to be cherished, and through that basically see or feel that community belongingness. I don't know if I can say it like this, but then I think that the Grateful is a perfect example for me of how with setting a certain fertile ground for us, we can nourish ourselves, and we can continue to do that over seasons and over time then.
I want to just kind of echo what Kenza said, to say thanks so much for this community that you're hosting, that you're creating. I mean, I'm getting so much out of it, but it's also just lovely to see this community as a kind of, a possibility of what can be. I think for me, that's so Like, it's just so valuable. It's almost like this role model or precedent of a community. And I just hope that we see so many more like this in the future.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Well, this whole thing only works because of active community members like both of you, the work that Sina puts in as well. It really is. It's a community that makes a community. So yeah, thank you all for being that. And yeah, we keep the momentum going and keep the conversation going. So thanks so much for listening in to our conversation. I hope you enjoyed getting some food for thought around this idea of community. And in case you're interested to dig deeper for yourself, here are some reflection questions that you could think through as a journaling exercise, or perhaps sit down with people in your community to talk about. The first question is, what does community mean for you? The second question, when and how has community supported you in either responding to or driving change? Question 3, how do you actively contribute to fostering and building community in the spaces that you occupy? And the last question, where in your life or work do you need the support of a community right now, and where might you find it? We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Grateful Podcast. Thanks so much for listening in. If you're interested to not only talk about community, but also be a part of a community of women who are really passionate about having a positive impact in the world and leading from the inside out, perhaps you want to join one of our programs. Applications are now open for the next round of Be the Change. This is a 4-month leadership and group coaching program that helps you build the foundations to lead sustainable change. We look at how change starts with each and every one of us. We move on to looking at community and communication to bring about change. And we wrap up the program looking at callings and courage, trying to understand better what are our unique strengths and gifts, and how can we find the intersection point between those and a need in the world to make our contribution in a way that's both sustainable and fulfilling. If you want to learn more about the program, just check out www.thegrateful.com/be the change, and you'll find the link to that in the show notes. Thanks so much for being here.